Set in the heart of England, amongst fertile fields, this is the Staffordshire village of Wheaton Aston. Today it is what we might term a typical commuter village. It sits within easy travelling distance of several nearby towns and cities. From the age of 9, kids here travel out of the village for their education. As a result, by day its suburban-like streets are quiet, the population at work or school some miles away. Just about everything in the village needs to be brought in from outside. The old, sick or unemployed are well looked after by the state. No one should go hungry. Yet, not that long ago, things were very different. Wheaton Aston can trace its origins back 900 years, and for most of that time it was a very isolated village linked only to the world by rutted tracks and bridleways. Through necessity it fed, clothed and housed its population with what it produced itself. It looked after its own poor, sick and needy as best it could. Life in the little village was hard and occasionally monotonous. Things started to slowly improve in 1835 when a canal arrived, opening up Wheaton Aston to the outside world. Its arrival coincided with some changes that, amongst other things, produced 2 large-scale and very informative maps that we have met before on previous DVD walks. One was the tithe map, and the other, our favourite, was drawn by the enigmatic village schoolmaster, Thomas Martin. We'd like to invite you to join us on a walk now, the third in a planned series of 4. We're going to follow some of Martin's tracks to the north of Wheaton Aston. En route, we'll look for some signs of how things began to change around the time of the canal's arrival. And, as is our custom, we'll be setting off from Chapel Bank. This is our planned route. First we will look at some old shops and farmhouses, our well-loved village hall and a little chapel that grew up from the Puritan Revolution. We'll continue to follow Marston Road for about 3/4 of a mile, calling in at the recreation ground, before eventually turning east across the fields. We'll attempt a brief geology lesson, duck under the canal and suggest an optional trip to the site of some World War II archaeology. The line of an old Roman road leads us across the Darnfords, and then after a few yards along the road to Church Eaton, we'll trek across Long Heath to Starkey's Lane. Down to the canal towpath for 100 yards or so, and then along Green Hill Lane to Malthouse Lane to see the site of the very first village school. We'll pass along some traditional village pathways to High Street and Frog Lane, arriving back to here. As well as using a couple of maps from the 1830s, our old friends the Tithe map and Thomas Martin's remarkable map, we're also going to use some 19th century census records starting in 1841 to trace a little of the history of some of the houses on our route. We will pass through what was once the heartland of Wheaton Aston's farmhouses, and we will see evidence of how the parish, left with the legacy of the Reformation, managed its poor. We will find out how a local World War II RAF station for a while became the second busiest in Britain, and how after the aeroplanes had left, it became home to some wartime allies. Comparing what I can see around me today with the 1838 tithe map, I notice that a lot of the buildings from the early 19th century are still here, even after its year 2000 makeover. Time travellers from the 19th century would still just about recognise today's Chapel Bank. They would definitely be impressed with the tarmac and the paving. The area has become part popular for outdoor village events.
For you here, Samler, why we need the goat? You all read this? Yes? Samler, why you need the goat?
Apart from the sights, sounds and smells of the busy 19th century working village, the most obvious absentee from here is the little chapel of ease that stood roughly where St Mary's Church stands today. It was only about half the size of the present building and has been built a long time ago in the prosperous times in the late 1200s, in the days when Wheaton Aston's residents were feudal tenants of the Benedictine monks at St Remy's Priory at Lapley. By the time we get into the middle of the 19th century, the often neglected and much patched up 550-year-old building was doomed. Adjoining the west end of the old church was the schoolhouse, the birthplace and home for the first 9 years of his life of the schoolmaster's son, William Hitchcock's.
William's mother departed this transitory life when he was only 8, and her headstone can be seen at Lapley.
Hitchcock's trained as a druggist in nearby Newport before moving first to Wednesbury and then at the age of 29 emigrating to South Australia. Clearly he had emotional memories of his home village, memories that he wrote down in his old age when in the already sophisticated town of Glenelg, now a beach resort, part of Adelaide. He had a lively mind and found life in Wheaton Aston very dull. He had few regrets about leaving.
60 or 70 years ago, the means of obtaining rational recreation were exceedingly limited, and we who live in the days of cheap concerts and entertainments of every kind, now provided for young and old, can hardly realise the monotonous sort of lives poor people had to lead in such villages as ours. No railways, telegraphs or telephones then, no newspapers except a weekly one published in our county town, price 6pence.
Wheaton Aston and the other villages were very isolated, connected to the outside world only by miles of rutted tracks. All traces of the tiny chapel of the Holy Trinity were removed when the new and well-loved St Mary's Church was built in the 1850s.
Although census records are a great source of info, they can also be a bit confusing. Not their fault really, but one thing our Victorian predecessors seemed to enjoy doing was renaming their streets and roads. Almost every street in every census gets a new name, which makes identifying who lived just where a tad difficult.
So where do you think Main Street, Newport Road, Market Square, Jubilee Streets were? Most houses and some streets are not given names at all,
but we'll do our best. One village place name that remains pretty constant is our regular start point here in Chapel Bank, and at the back of St Mary's Church, 3 buildings listed on the 1841 census are still very much here. These 2 lovingly restored properties, Clyde Cottage and Chapel House, were originally one farmhouse. Their long history has been painstakingly researched back to the 17th century by the present owners of Chapel House, and the buildings that we see are not the first on this site. They stand in a prime village position and were built or rebuilt possibly behind the older buildings shortly after the Great Wheaton Aston Fire of 1777.
The art of brickmaking goes back thousands of years, but was largely lost in Britain after the departure of the Romans until Tudor times. Lapley House and the Bradford Arms are 2 of the earliest brick buildings in the parish. Bricks were difficult to transport any distance and were therefore made locally. According to the Trade Directory, Thomas Foster and Charles Parkes were making bricks in Wheaton Aston in 1834. In 1784, during the reign of George III, a tax of 4 shillings per 1,000 was levied on bricks to help pay for the wars with the American colonies. To combat this, bricks were simply made larger, and we can see here how this has happened during the construction of Chapel House.
The main part of the house was clearly reconstructed shortly before and after 1784.
But what I most want you to see is up here. The house may be 230 years old, but I'm told that the roof timbers are much older, dating from early Tudor times. Around 1500, the same age as the other old houses that we've looked at earlier. And, oh my gosh, these are amazing. Roofs of timber frame buildings tended to last longer than the walls and were often reused. And if we were nearer the sea, I'd say that these came from a ship. Clearly, these are reused, full of redundant holes and notches, not really meant to be seen. These bedrooms were converted recently in the loft space. It's beautiful. Look, we can see here the carpenter's marks in the joints. The structure would have been constructed flat and lifted into position. As the village expanded, the farmstead here became more and more remote from its fields. Although it continued as a farmhouse until 1867, I suspect that it was its prime position that was one of the reasons for its change of use. On the death of its then owner, Edmund Wigan, Esquire, of Lapley House, the farm's 85 acres were sold to industrialist John Hartley, and the house a little later to butcher and grocer Reuben Wheat.
For the first half of the 20th century, the house was owned by the Sherwin family. John Sherwin ran a grocer's and provision store, and he was followed by his son James, who was a master timber faller. It was James who separated the old house into two dwellings. It has been a grocer's, a butcher's, a bakery, a stonemason's, a provision store, an antique shop, and even the local doctor's surgery and dispensary. Lived in by some of Wheaton Aston's iconic families, the Jarvises, Childs, Wheats and Sherwins.
What was the Hare and Hounds pub and the adjacent house were built by the Shotton family shortly after the Great Fire of 1777. No church would be complete without the pub next door. William Shotton had surrendered his newly built tenement to the Lord of the Manor in 1779, and a few years later he opened its doors as a pub. The pub remained in the Shotton family for over 70 years. It was bought in 1897 by the Hinkersman Brewery Company of Sheffield, which eventually became part of the Banks's chain. Kept by Walter and Mary Burgess during the first half of the 20th century, it eventually closed as a pub in 1935.
Interestingly, the pub and adjacent house on what we call today the Cobbles are on the 1851 census recorded as being on Market Square.
In the census year 1851, the former chapel of the Holy Trinity was just about still here. It had no enclosed garden and was substantially smaller than today's St Mary's Church, leaving an area behind big enough for a small market. The only way for an isolated village like ours to survive and get things that they couldn't grow or make themselves in times gone by was to trade. Markets and fairs were used for trading and hiring labour for farm work. Wheaton Aston had been granted a licence to hold a fair and market way back in 1280, and almost certainly the events must have been held in the village pretty constantly.
The 1851 Trade Directory tells us that fairs were held twice yearly in Wheaton Aston for cattle and swine. Perhaps this was the spot.
In the first half of the 19th century, in what is now the new medical centre, John and Harriet Starkey ran a draper's cum grocery shop for at least 14 years. But by 1851, John was ill, and in March 1852 was dead from an abscess of the shoulder.
One of the Starkeys' regular customers had been the Scuts charity, the same charity that paid the schoolmaster's salary. In 1669, Joan Scutt had left in her will provision to pay £1, that's 20 shillings in old money, a year to the poor of Lapley parish. 33 years later, in 1702, Thomas Scott added to the pot that left a provision for £5 a year to be paid to the vicar and £10 a year to the schoolmaster in Wheaton Aston. Not content with this, he left a further £3 a year to the poor of Lapley parish, making £4 in all for the poor. £2 was to be paid out at Christmas and £2 at Easter. The money at Easter could be taken as cloth, and often was, as can be seen in the register of payments. In these earlier times, almost all clothes, bed linen, soft furnishings were made in the home from cloth bought locally. John Sayer and his wife competed with the Starkeys from their house-cum-shop across the street in the 1840s. Not surprisingly, even a little village like Wheaton Aston could support 2 drapier shops. By 1881, Charles Harthill was baking bread in the village, and early in the 20th century, it's Charles's son, George's initial over the door. The shop window looks to be a recent addition.
In one window we can see sides of bacon, and on the other side we can glimpse some lovely crusty loaves. The lack of refrigeration meant that cured pork and bacon was the principal meat eaten by the ordinary folk. Bread, even when not so crusty, made up 80% of the average person's diet.
The business continued into the 20th century when William Child modernised, offering a local delivery service. He renamed the building Lee Bank House. For many it would always be the old bakery. The 2 photos here clearly show that the street was handsomely cobbled, indicating its importance, and hence the present-day name. No doubt a century or so ago, all Wheaton Aston streets would have been similarly cobbled.
The shop would appear to have no garden, but in fact it did. The site of the houses across the road was part of the property and served eventually as a coal storage yard. This very sad-looking set of buildings were once a rather elegant Georgian farmhouse and shop. They date from shortly after the 1777 Wheaton Aston Great Fire. This is another old village site.
The number on the 1838 tithe map is 469, and the owner-occupier was George Healy. The impressive family tomb at Lapley, believe it or not, is a Grade II listed building, and it tells of an often tragic life. The census says that George was a farmer and still here in 1841, and that Thomas Guy Healy was a draper and grocer on the same site.
Old census returns show that Wheaton Aston was never been short of a butcher or 2, although early times the job description would have been more on the emphasis of the slaughter and the cutting of animals than on the sale of meat. For nearly half a century, the Laurels was associated with cattle dealers and butchers Charles and Harry Mason from Blemmill. The house and old farm buildings were converted into the shop and slaughterhouse. Charles's son Cyril was in charge into the 1940s. It certainly served as a butcher's during much of the 20th century, run at various times by the Masons, Whiteways and Churchills. Our present-day post office was built on part of the site of George Healy's farmstead and the latter butcher's shop. It was first a greengrocer's shop, but incorporated the post office after the retirement of Mr. Bernard Mayland from the adjacent post office in 1972. The village had got another shop by 1886, which by 1896 was being run by grocer William Swetnam. He became village postmaster in 1897. The new shop would have stood just about in the middle of today's road.
Swetnam was replaced by William Hughes by 1901. But not for long. By December 1901, he in turn was replaced by George Mayland, and the shop remained in the Mayland family for the next 70 years.
It was George Mayland's elderly son, Bernard, who was here when the house, buildings and gloomy little post office cum shop were demolished in 1972. When younger, Bernard had run a cattle haulage business. The new houses were deliberately built well back from the road to allow for widening. This notoriously dangerous exit from Hawthorne Road was almost blind till the late 1980s.
The present owner of the corner house, born in Wheaton Aston, has named the house to preserve the name of a landmark that everyone knew.
Following some good work by the Reverend Charles Luxmore, the Vicar of Lapley, a parish reading and recreation room was built in 1886 at a cost of £240.
Our friend Mr. G.T. Hartley coughed up £80, and the lord of the manor, Mr. Frederick Hay Swinfen, gave the land. The remaining £160 was raised by public subscription. The original trustees were 4 major landowners and a prosperous butcher, namely the Earl of Bradford, Frederick Hay Swinfen, George T. Hartley, Edward Smith, the Wensbury tube maker, and Frederick Holland of the Hawthorns.
Years later, in 1899, it was deemed too small and was extended. It eventually became a male-dominated billiard hall, and in 1927, the newly formed Women's Institute had nowhere to hold their meetings. It was solved by building their own hall, an ex-World War I army hut from Cannock Chase, in School Road, as we saw in our first DVD. This building only became the village hall again in 1965. And remains today very much the centre of village life.
And he's coming back to live here?
I don't so.
Oh, stop it! Oh, behave yourself!
Oh dear. That's where me feather boa got to. Well, hello, I didn't see you there.
The 1838 tithe map shows a cottage on the site of the present village hall, number 501, owned and occupied by Maria Macefield. The 1841 census tells us that Sarah Macefield, a 60-year-old independent lady, was living there.
Her address, Long Street, Old Poorhouse. As we saw earlier, the poorhouses and workhouses had been taken from the responsibility of the parish in 1834.
Left into Marston Road, or according to Thomas Martin, this street was called Main Street, likely named after Main Farm, which has a rear wing dating from the 1600s. In fact, he calls the road right through from Town's End, by today's First School, to Old Smithy Corner on Chapel Bank, Main Street. Before the 1980s road improvements, the crossroads here in both directions were more offset. Compare this 1950s photo with the view today. The crossroads sign looks like it should be a T-junction. For a bit of fun, see if you can find any old crossroads in the parish that are not offset. Better still, on Thomas Martin's map, we can see just how offset they were in 1836 and how much wider. Oddly, Martin shows a traffic island in the space. Could this be the world's first traffic island?
But look how he describes the section between here and Malthouse Lane.
Malthouse Lane to the Pinfold. The traffic island he has drawn is the village Pinfold, an enclosure where stray animals were collected awaiting collection, right in the middle of the village.
5 years later, at the time of the 1841 census, Queen Victoria was now newly crowned, and the lane is now called Queen Street, a narrow, leafy lane until 1975. The Congregationalist Zion Chapel has been the dominant building here for over 200 years. The Congregationalists are a nonconformist group built on the work of the 16th century Protestant movement.
Each Congregationalist church is self-governed by the local community. The early Congregationalists sought to separate themselves from the Anglican Church in every possible way, and even forewent having a church building. They met outdoors and in homes for many years.
In the year 1777, George Barder, an itinerant preacher, together with George Wesley's contemporary and associate John Fletcher, Vicar of Madeley, and other revivalists, continued this practice under an oak tree just a few yards from here. Large congregations of people from around the district gathered to hear them, and they were much moved, some weeping, some praying, and many singing. Open-air services were not always ideal, and eventually a house on this site was certified as the venue.
This was replaced in 1814 by what is the basis of the present building. In the year 1906, extensive renovations were commenced. The church was completely remodelled. A new schoolroom was added, together with a new entrance and domestic offices. The cost of this work amounted to £526.
For this work, the church owes much to the zeal and foresight of George Cambridge of High Hall, Blimmel. He was the church secretary and gave oversight to the whole undertaking. In the year 1908, the work was completed and the opening performed by the well-known radio pastor, Reverend Dr. Parks Catman of Brooklyn Congregational Church in the USA. By the time of his death in 1936, he was called the foremost minister of congregational faith by the New York Times. There was a large congregation, many unable to enter, but with the windows and the doors opened, they were able to join in the service from outside. The new church presented an inspiring witness to the Christian work of the kingdom. On December 6, 1934, the church suffered a great loss in the sudden death of Molly Owen at the early age of 40 years. She was the only daughter of George and Margaret Ann Cambridge and the wife of Captain David Price Owen of Brookhouse Farm. She was baptised in the church and at the age of only 14 appointed organist. For many years she trained and conducted the children's choir at the Sunday school anniversary. It was said that she possessed a radiant personality, full of zeal and enthusiasm for Christ.
Few remember her now, but her unusual grave in the new churchyard at Lapley tells us a little of what she was like. Her granddaughter, Molly Price Owen, went on to become a presenter on BBC Radio's Woman's Hour and a producer with the BBC World Service.
This building housed Wheaton Aston's first automatic telephone exchange. Phone lines had arrived in Wheaton Aston in the early 1920s.
The very first switchboard was housed at Clara Brown's home in School Road and manned by Clara between 9 a.m. and 7 p.m.
Before the 1970s, this section of Marston Road was dominated by three old cottages: Rose Cottage, Inglenut Cottage and Jasmine Cottage. They are most clearly identified on the 1886 Ordnance Survey map and can be glimpsed on the 1952 aerial photo. Rose Cottage made way for these houses in the early 1970s. Inglenut Cottage village is shown having a smithy attached on the 1886 map, according to the 1891 census run by William Hadley. Finally, opposite was Jasmine Cottages, 5 tiny dwellings owned in the 19th century by shoemaker Peter Anslow.
In the 19th century, shoemaking was a big employer in Wheaton Aston. Shoes and boots took quite a bashing in the wet and mud and would require regular repair work if they were to last any length of time. Anslow himself dwelt in one of the houses. The others were let to his workers.
Just set back from the road here was White House Farm. During the shortages of World War II and afterwards, the Ministry of Agriculture, through its county committees, evicted more than 10,000 farmers that it considered guilty of poor husbandry.
The farm, they call it White House Farm. It was Bevan's farm, wasn't it?
Yes, it's Bevan's.
And they were turned out on the road during the war.
Were they?
Yes, and I was there and I saw it all happen. They carried all the furniture out and everything and put it all on the side of the road. And poor old Baba and they was all, well, it was terrible, wasn't it? And that was done by, well, I think Dick Campbell was the instigator of it.
Round the corner in 1838, number 518, was Elizabeth Saunders' beer shop and garden. By the 20th century, it was Downford Farm and demolished around 1960 to build these houses. Opposite, number 460, is still with us. And in 1838 it was Joseph Mill's beer shop, garden and shoemaker's shop, and would continue to be so for many years. The badge over the door tells us that he was properly insured.
White's Directory of Staffs lists 11 shoemakers in the village in 1851, although in the census for that year even more give their occupation as shoemakers. One village shoemaker is known to have walked to Stafford on Saturdays with the tops made during the week, bringing home the leather for the next week's work.
In 1867, the new co-op began selling boots bought by Canals from Manchester. And by 1872, the number of shoemakers had shrunk to 5. The pupils of St Mary's Old First School in School Road relocated here on November the 2nd, 1994. The school then was already 13 years old and having opened as a purpose-built middle school in 1981. And I know that I don't look old enough, but I was one of those original pupils. This apparently unremarkable field, with its neighbour over the fence, has a very remarkable history dating back maybe 1,000 years.
The group of fields here is the Coldmoors on Thomas Martin's map, and the Coldmoor Meadow here was bought by the parish in the mid-1990s as a recreation ground.
It is proving a great buy, coming more and more into its own every year. The fantastic new play area was opened in February this year to complement the already highly successful skateboard park.
It's really nice of you to come and help us launch this wonderful new playground, and I'm very, very pleased to welcome Jeremy Roy, our FC, and for him to officially open the skate park and the playground. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm going to shout to try and make myself heard. Firstly, I'd like to, it's a real privilege to have Councillor McArdle here, who, as you know, is chairman of...
Now, if the Motti Meadows down the way are special, then these fields, had they remained as they were 150 years ago, would have made the natural England boffins drool.
We only have to look at how these apparently unremarkable fields are represented on Thomas Martin's remarkable 1836 map to see that for some reason in those days they were very special. The name Cald or Cold Moors indicate that our ancestors found that the soil here was unproductive, not suitable for the plough. We can see in this footage shot in 1994 that the field looked very different to the green sward that we find today. The name Cald Moor looks an apt description.
The reason for its moor-like appearance can be found in this little section of the field just through here. Water here lies below the surface, trapped mainly by a layer of impervious clay. The clay below also makes the ground above very boggy. By digging through the clay layer and inserting a pipe, water is released, flowing to the surface. For many years, water apparently flowed eternally from a pipe here into a stone trough.
Beautiful spring, isn't it? Never known it dry, have you? No. In that very drought, it's only water was in the parish, wasn't it? Yeah. One time there, yeah.
When the field was purchased by the parish council, the first thing that had to be done before it could be put to its new use was to remove the pipe and get it drained.
It's been in the air for so many minutes it accumulates, but the water's coming out that ground, and we took the sample out of that spring just over the edge, and there was not a slightest bit of nitrogen or anything in the water. It's absolutely perfect to drink, and I've got that in black and white.
Have you? So why then, in 1836 and since time immemorial, did almost every farmer in this village want a slice, no matter how thin, of the Cald Moors? The answer is hay. We cannot overemphasise the importance to farmers of hay. A farmer with working horses may need to keep as much as a third of his land for hay. These fields were important hay meadows, especially in the times of drought. Standing on a sea of water, farmers could rely on these fields remaining perpetually wet, so producing a reliable crop of hay. As the late Mr. Gordon Blakemore told us back in 1994, there are springs not only in this field, but also in the next field as well.
I've got a beautiful springs in the next field.
Have you?
Yeah.
How many?
2, 3 working there. Pumping a lot of water out there.
The unfenced fields were marked out by stones called doles every February, and all animals removed until August after the hay had been harvested. The farmers were then permitted to return the animals to the field to graze the remaining grass and fertilise the field with their manure.
Bowels of the earth. It's on a sea of water here, isn't it?
When the 19th century property speculators like Iron Master John Hartley and tube maker Edward Smith moved in and purchased these and other fields in Wheaton Aston, the old doles were amalgamated into larger fields, and memories of the old precious hay meadows faded away.
Some road walking now along Martin's Lane 17-2, Long Furlong Lane end to Shushian's Turn, 906 yards without a footpath. Martin calls this road Marsden Road, the main road to Nosal, Chatwell, Wood Eaton, On, Orslow and Newport. The slang here looks to have an uninhabited building on it on the 1838 tithe map and is called Hill Yard, but it is described simply as pasture.
Slangs were roadside houses and gardens taken by squatters in the distant past. They were usually on the edges of the parish, on the commons or wastes, and if the squat survived long enough, the buildings were allowed to become part of the parish and remain. Wheaton Aston has several. Note here how on the map the road is cutting diagonally across the one field, dividing it into two. It looks as if today's road started life as a track, probably a hayway across open fields to the motti meadows beyond. The odd bit on the right is called Little End.
Pass the time by working out the age of hedges. They do say that a hedge picks up a new variety every 100 years or so. So there's hawthorn, ash, oak, holly. So 100, 200, 300, 400. I'll come back later and we'll get some more of these. Yeah, so you get a bottle of gin and you get some bowl full of sloes, and then you prick the sloes with a little pin, and then you put the sloes in the gin, and then at Christmas give it to your friends and they love you.
White House Farm perpetuates the name of one of the Wheaton Aston's lost farms that were demolished in the 1960s.
This is the most northerly entrance into the famous Motti Meadows, or the Mickle Moors as they were once known. To our forefathers, the precious hay would be collected and stacked in the entrance here, awaiting collection.
Hay would be taken to the rickyard and built into stacks. It would then be cut up into trusses weighing 60 pounds each, ready for sale. Hay trussing was a recognised trade and was hard and specialised work. Several men called themselves hay trussers on the census returns.
At last, the Shushians turn and we're off the road again.
Heading along Martin's Bridleway, Park Lane, Shushians turn to the centre of Aqueduct across clay furlongs. There are the remains of some big clay pits by White House Farm. The limey clay called marl had quite a few uses. It was needed for bricks, tiles, building, but largely as a soil improver. Most of the old fields around here would not be complete without a marl pit.
Geology is a most complex subject, filled with words like Uriconian clasts and gneissises and schists and triassics, all designed, it seems, to tell you not to bother. However, undeterred, let's go and have a look and see what's under our feet in Wheaton Aston.
Geologists call it Cooper marl or Mercian mudstones. Reddish-brown clays and sandstones deposited in a lake or inland sea during the Permian and Triassic periods, 290 to 208 million years ago.
We in the West Midlands are very familiar with the smooth, round pebbles that occur in the soil around here. They look like they might have come from some beach somewhere. They are in fact remnants of a giant river which flowed when Britain was much nearer to the equator between 230 and 180 million years ago. The brownish ones are called liver-coloured quartzites, and they are far travelled. Nearby Cannock Chase is the largest bed of these pebbles in Europe. Among these among these smoother stones, we find some intruders, larger, rougher stones that seem quite out of place. They're called erratics and haven't been here anywhere near as long, not in geological terms anyway. They were dropped when the ice melted at the end of the last ice age at around 15,000 years ago. Some are clearly granite,
maybe from Scotland or Cumbria.
The old maps show a lane on the route we are following. There is no sign of the lane here now, just our footpath. From this aerial photo, we can see the distinct outline of ancient ridge and furrows in these fields. They are very old and no doubt have some connection with the clay pits.
Thomas Martin, in 1836, not surprisingly, called this little bit the aqueduct.
The low-lying fields around here are called the marsh, for obvious reasons, probably a botanist's dream. The canal was closed for a few weeks in the winter of 2010 for serious engineering works. Badgers had dug into the west side, causing the banks to become unstable.
The brickwork of the aqueduct seems to be standing up very well after 175 years. The embankment here is something that you, like us, probably take for granted, but it was quite an undertaking in 1830. We're going to make a detour up onto the canal towpath. This is a regular shortcut for walkers, but not a recommended footpath, so if you do follow us, please be careful. We're going to walk half a mile north and look at a little bit more recent history.
Somebody I'm longing to see. I hope that he turns out to be someone to watch over me.
A little over there is what was known locally as Little On Aerodrome, the former World War II airfield known strangely as RAF Wheaton Aston. We say strangely as it is not in Wheaton Aston at all, but in Church Eaton Parish.
Construction of the 3 concrete runways and site buildings began in 1940 and the airfield was opened for business in 1941.
RAF Wheaton Aston became the base for Service Training School number 21, Advanced Flying Unit. The main site was here at Little On, and it had a communal site with accommodation for 1,800 personnel a few hundred yards away at High On. By 1942, the airfield had 71 brightly painted airspeed Oxfords, an aeroplane known affectionately as the Ox Box. The base was established to process pilots prior to them being sent on to operational training as a fighter or bomber pilots. The intensive course lasted for 6 weeks.
As D-Day approached in May 1944, the second busiest airfield in Britain was not on the south coast supporting the Normandy invasion forces, but in rural Staffordshire. In that month, the staggering 10,837 flying hours were logged at RAF Wheaton Aston. It may have been a training base, but it was no cushy number, far from it.
A serious incident was recorded here on average once a week. It specialised in training the pilots for the hazards of night flying, and training was carried out 24/7. Between flights, engines were kept running to speed up changeovers. When flying in daylight, pilots wore special goggles to simulate nighttime conditions. Highly dangerous work. Lives were lost on training flights from here. Pilots losing their way and crashing both locally and in Wales and the Peak District. On January the 1st, 1943, Flight Sergeant J. Gilmore died when his aircraft hit a tree and crashed to the ground during night flying. On the 18th of October, 1943, Pilot Officer Dennis Kine from New Zealand took off from here with 2.5 hours of fuel on board on a training flight over Shropshire. The failure of a beacon at Shawbury caused him to become hopelessly lost in bad weather, and he crashed 56 miles away on Featherbed Moss in the Derbyshire Peak District. One particularly tragic story was told by Harold Mick Stone, an instructor, in 1943.
I became very friendly with the then Chief Flying Instructor, Squadron Leader Spear, affectionately known as Dagger Spear. He was to fly the station commander somewhere, but as he got to the aircraft he must have forgotten his map, so returned to the flight office. To return to his aircraft he had to walk along the perimeter track in front of several Oxfords running up, and in his haste he failed to remove his helmet. By a tragic coincidence, a young Spitfire pilot was taxiing behind him at an excessive speed and in a straight line instead of zigzagging as he was supposed to do to improve his visibility. His propeller caught Dagger on the nape of his neck, sending him rolling along in a ball. He was dead by the time we got to him.
An American Mustang with engine trouble crashed into the canal here, killing its pilot. He was found outside of his plane, apparently having lit a cigarette before he died. The plane blocked the canal for some time and was much visited by local lads who seized the opportunity to collect souvenirs. No memorial has been erected locally, but there is one grave in Church Eaton for an airman who probably took his last flight from RAF Wheaton Aston. The station was declared abandoned by the RAF in July 1947, but parts of it remained in use for another 18 years. In 1947, the accommodation on the communal site was used again as a transit depot for the Polish resettlement corps. Large numbers of displaced Polish people passed through Wheaton Aston from many countries, including France, Italy, Lebanon, East Africa and the Sudan, on their way to the USA, Canada or other parts of the world. But many stayed and made their homes in the prefab huts of the former airfield. The National Assistance Board Control terminated on the 7th of May 1954. And what was formerly the Wheaton Aston Polish resettlement camp became a large British-Polish housing estate with its own church, bus service, shops, post office and cinema, created out of converted huts. At its peak, so popular had the camp become that church services would bring in a large congregation from all around the district. Wheaton Aston people would regularly visit the camp for the cinema and other social events. The local boys played in the camp football team, and pigeon flyers would share their stories in the former Fox pub at Marsden. The residents were gradually rehomed and the camp finally closed in 1965. The Caravan Club now enjoy what was site number 2, but a few brick and concrete buildings that were used as the Polish church are all that remain of the former RAF camp communal site today. The multitude of wooden sheds on the main site are survivors of a poultry progeny testing station that followed the airfield. That closed around 1960. Only the runways and a few station buildings of the former Littlon aerodrome survive today, 64 years after they were abandoned.
The path we are following runs between Marston and Lapley. Marston was part of the ancient manor of Lapley. Just here, continuing on Thomas Martin's Bridleway 18.2, we are following a line of a Roman road across the Darnfords. Darnford is a corruption of Durnford or Hidden Ford. This area was boggy heathland before the 17th century.
Some 20 years ago, a wily metal detectorist, aware of the possibility of finding something Roman here, picked up a particularly strong signal from his machine. Too big, he thought, to be a Roman coin. And he was right. It was not one Roman coin, but dozens of the beggars. He found a sack-shaped hoard of bronze coins fused tightly together. Had they fallen off the back of a cart? As far as we know, they're the only Roman objects ever to be uncovered in Lapley Parish. But where are they now?
We have emerged onto what Martin calls Thinwood Lane near Stony Ford. A few yards on the road back into the fields across Martin's Path number 29, 675 yards to road number 19.
These fields are called the Thinwoods and were part of Wheaton Aston's common lands until the 18th of November 1622.
On that day, as part of a deal with the Lord of the Manor, Walter Brooke of Lapley House, the copyholders, that is the customary tenants of the Manor of Aston, lost all their rights to lands, wastes and the commons known as Thinwood Heath. They seem to have got only a couple of things in return. Firstly, the establishment of the use of rents for certain fields for the repair of the two parish churches. And secondly, an agreement to pay fixed payments to the Lord to allow new tenants admittance to the manor. In 1622, the cost of the upkeep of churches was a big problem to the parish, and this establishment of church lands provided an income for the church wardens to help keep the church in good repair.
If the new tenant was your widow, the amount was 1 whole year and a quarter's the value of the land. If it was your son or someone else, then it was only 1 year's the value. To an avaricious landlord, a widow was unlikely to be a good tenant. The lords agreed that providing the said payment was made, they would not ask for any more and would admit the said tenant.
This form of land tenure was known as copyhold because the holder had a copy of the record of his holding entered into the manorial roll. This payment came to apply also when buying and selling land in the manor. One advantage was this gave the owner some sort of title and made the buying and selling of property easier. These were the last of the ancient feudal obligations to survive and were only abolished in 1935. These fields are Long Heath. We shall pass Short Heath soon. No sign of ridge and furrow here. In the early 1600s, a third of the parish was still heathland. Sorry about the styles. Starkey's Lane, named after the Starkey family that lived in the Slang at the end of this lane. Martin called it Green Lane, high road to Church Eaton and Stafford.
Bridge 19 or Tavern Bridge to Bridge 18 or Mills Bridge through a small cutting. These fields on either side of here were known as the Green Hill. The cutting drives its way through the Little Green Hill. This area was known as Short Heath, and Thomas Martin knew this bridge as Short Heath Bridge. Later it was more commonly known as Mills Bridge after Joseph Mills the shoemaker, who we saw earlier. Joseph had a garden here alongside the canal. On Thomas Martin's map this is Lane 23. He gives us a couple of alternative names, Greenhill Lane or Short Heath Lane. To the right here is a lane which has had two names over the years. Martin calls it Old In-Place Lane, but now it is Magazine Lane. After a couple of 100 yards, the newly built canal blocked this lane and a new access had to be built to the old in-place on the other side. In 1862, a licence was granted for the erection of a powder magazine on a field running alongside the canal. The gunpowder was brought by barge from Liverpool or Manchester for storage in the small wood-lined brick building in which soft-soled shoes had to be worn for safety. The old magazine stood in the corner of the field now occupied by canal boaters. The powder was then delivered in a green tarpaulin-covered horse-drawn wagon to Birmingham, where it was used to make cartridges, or to Cannock, where it was used in the mines. Why it was not safer just to continue along the canal, I don't know. The magazine buildings continued to be in use until the First World War, after which they were occasionally used for storing hay. We emerge at the junction with Martin's Back Lane, now known, of course, as the continuation of Greenhill Lane. Greenhill Lane was uninhabited and well outside the village centre until around 1960. The powder magazine was very isolated. We're doing a tiny figure of 8 just to tie up some loose ends. This is Malthouse Lane, and hooray! Thomas Martin's map agrees. But not the 1851 census. They called the lane Newport Road. Malthouse Farm gave its name to the lane, and all 4 farms that were in its short length dated from the 16th or 17th centuries. The first one that we would have come to was a house and farm called The Croft that stood here until 1982. It had a long association with the Blakemore family, the oldest family in Wheaton Aston, going back at least to the 17th century. On the tithe map, number 461, Mary Blakemore was the owner of a house and blacksmith shop here. Local historian Mary Wheat, tracing the history of schooling in Wheaton Aston, concluded that this was the site of the village's first school, established by a charity amounting to £10 a year from the rent from certain fields left in the will of Thomas Scott in 1703. Incidentally, the same charity was still supporting William Hitchcock's father as schoolmaster 120 years later. Mary must have had a eureka moment when putting together the facts as she came to her conclusion. The lane at the north of the croft, which Martin calls Greenhouse Lane, but was known locally as Shooting House Pit Lane, a corruption she deduced of Tutoring House Pit Lane. The lane was not made up into a road until World War II, when it was surfaced to accommodate traffic building the new airfield. The original name of Shooting House Pit must have been as mysterious to that generation as today's name of Fenton House Lane is to us. Close by, Malthouse Farm is part timber framed, and according to the experts was originally built in the 16th century during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. It became part of the estate of ironmaster John Hartley in the mid-19th century and was sold privately to the tenant along with the rest of Wheaton Aston's Hall estate in 1920, following the death of John Hartley's son, George. The introduction of what became known as death duties by the Liberal government saw the break-up of many 19th century estates and country houses. For most of the 20th century it was in the possession of the Marson family, until the retirement of Mr. Sidney Marson in the 1990s. Akesmore Farm stood here. The monkey puzzle tree from the front gardens stood fast long after the demolition of the 17th century farmhouse and the Canadian barn in 1965. The tithe map shows us the location of Providence Farm. We can see that it was equally as old as Malthouse Farm, but survives today only in faded, blurry photographs. For 20 years this was the farm of the father of our schoolmaster friend, William Hitchcock's. Thomas Hitchcock's had bought the 146 acres in 1830 with a legacy from his aunt, before he and his family took the boat to join William in Australia. It eventually succumbed to new housing estates in the 1960s. Opposite Pinfold Lane is Workhouse Lane and Workhouse Field. This little cottage was owned by the parish in 1836. By tradition, Pinfold Cottage has always been assumed to be Wheaton Aston's Pinfold, where stray animals were kept while awaiting reclamation by their owners. A couple of instances during the later 19th century census shows people living at this cottage and calling it the Pinfold. But earlier, the 1851 census describes the house as Lapley Old Workhouse. What it certainly was until it closed in 1834 was the village workhouse. After 1834, small parish workhouses were amalgamated into unions of workhouses, and Lapley Parish became part of the Penkridge Union, based in Brood. Looking back, the destruction of many of Wheaton Aston's irreplaceable historic old farmhouses and cottages in the 1950s and 60s will appear to be unforgivable, but perhaps it's too easy to be critical. The village no longer had use for its outdated farms. The buildings that went had largely deteriorated to a point where, to make them habitable again, would have left little of the original structure. We may think that today's Wheaton Aston lacks charm, but perhaps just enough to survive, to remind us that here was once a real, vibrant village peopled by hard-working farmers and tradespeople. A real village that once throbbed with activity. A village that has been beloved by many generations who've passed this way before.
Next time, on our final DVD of this series, we will be going east. We will look at the descent of the manor till any rights belonging to that position were finally abolished. We shall look at what happened at Lapley during the 17th century Civil War and how a 19th century court action finally brought about the sale of the Lord of Lapley Manor's lands. I can hardly wait. As always, thank you very much for watching.